So it's 2018, and I'm sure, like me, you heard the announcement that, there's a new Song of Ice and Fire book coming out. And I'm sure, like me, you thought it was the finally, it's going to be the prophesized Winds of Winter. Man, it's not. It's, well, Fire and Blood. So, needless to say, Fire and Blood had less than a warm welcome amongst the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom. Being described as a Targaryen family history book, the book only covers, well, less than half of the Targaryen family history. So, no Robert's Rebellion, no Blackfire Rebellions, and no Summerhall. The book received less than stellar reviews on release, and the book itself, it's not written like a history book. No, instead, it's written from a perspective of a maester writing on the events of the Targaryen history within the Song of Ice and Fire universe. That's like to the third degree of meta, I think. If I don't know, I guess if that's how you do math. This leaves much of the events still clouded in mystery, doubt, and ambiguity. Instead of the George version of the Silmarillion, we got something I think is much more better. So, in this deep dive, I'm going to bust out that useless history degree I got a couple years ago, and we're going to go page by page, paragraph by paragraph, and even line by line to suss out what is really going on in this book and to the Targaryens. There will be many, many, many parts to this. And before we even say it, yes, I know Preston Jacobs is doing something similar, but I'm going to go one step beyond. And we're going to start from the very beginning of the book. And hopefully, I can offer a different insight that even the godfather of A Song of Ice and Fire theories doesn't have. So, let's get nerdy and start reading.
The Maesters of the Citadel, who keep the histories of Westeros, have used Aegon's conquest as their touchstone for the past 300 years. Births, deaths, battles, and other events are dated either AC, after the conquest, or BC, before the conquest. True scholars know that such dating is far from precise. Aegon Targaryen's conquest of the Seven Kingdoms did not take place in a single day. More than 2 years passed between Aegon's landing and his Old Town coronation, and even then the conquest remained incomplete, since Dorne remained unsubdued. Sporadic attempts to bring the Dornishmen into the realm continued all through King Aegon's reign as well into the reigns of his sons, making it impossible to fix a precise end date for the Wars of Conquest.
We can see here that this text is being written from the perspective of a maester from the Citadel of Old Town, namely Archmaester Gildane. He's going into the explanation of the dating system in Fire and Blood, being BC and AC, or before conquest and after conquest, respectively. Although the Maesters themselves seem not to divulge what system of dating Westeros used before Aegon's conquest, or when this new dating system itself was implemented. Did the Citadel hold a great convention for the new dating system? Did Aegon have any influence on this? I don't know. The text is moot about it. As in our own world, when we were switching from AD and BC, it was created sometime in the 5th century, but it did not see widespread use for a few more centuries after that.
Even the start date is a matter of some misconception. Many assume, wrongly, that the reign of Aegon I Targaryen began on the day he landed on the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, beneath the three hills where the city of King's Landing would eventually stand. Not so. The day of Aegon's landing was celebrated by the king and his descendants, but the conqueror actually dated the start of his reign from the day he was crowned and anointed in the starry sept of Old Town by the High Septon of the Faith. This coronation took place 2 years after Aegon's landing, well after all three of the major battles of the Wars of Conquest had been fought and won. Thus, can be seen that most of Aegon's actual conquering took place from 2 to 1 BC before the conquest.
It is interesting that the Maesters writing the histories dispute when the conquest itself actually started. They state that many believed it began when Aegon landed at what would become King's Landing. But who is this many that is spoken of? The small folk in the area? The Targaryens and their Valyrian allies? The text does state the day of his landing was celebrated by the king and his descendants, but then later states that Aegon himself dated the start of his reign when he was crowned by the High Septon in Old Town. So perhaps at first Aegon wanted to be recorded that his reign began the day he landed on Westeros, but perhaps to please the Maesters of the Citadel and the Faith of the Seven, but perhaps he deferred to their judgment on setting the day of his coronation as the beginning of his official reign. This must have been done retroactively, perhaps after the end of hostilities with Dorne, as it seems that Aegon was keen on uniting all of Westeros south of the Wall. So the War of Aegon's Conquest could have been not just 2 years, but rather 11 years in total. And this does parallel our own real-world history. A good example is the end of the First Crusade of 1099. Historians generally mark that as the end date for the First Crusade, as crusading forces captured Jerusalem. Despite the fact they were still continuing fighting for nearly a year afterward, both from the remaining crusading forces in Jerusalem and from a force of crusaders that joined the crusade late. All this shows that even in the beginning, the Maesters are attempting to control the narrative of Westerosi history, not overtly, but clandestinely.
The Targaryens were of pure Valyrian blood, dragonlords of ancient lineage. 12 years before the Doom, 114 BC, Aenar Targaryen sold his holdings in the freehold in the lands of the Long Summer and moved with all his wives, wealth, slaves, dragons, siblings, kin, and children to Dragonstone, a bleak island citadel beneath a smoking mountain in the narrow sea.
So we are told that Aenar, the patriarch of the Targaryen family, sold all his holdings in the freehold and moved his entire household, including his wives, plural, wives. What is interesting is that both in the source history and other supplemental material, it does not list any of Aenar's wives' names. The only source I could find is out of the book itself, and I'll try not to do this, but I found it interesting. There is a prop history book used in the series House of the Dragon. It contains text stating that Daenerys the Dreamer's mother was named Elena Targaryen. In the show canon, Elena is described as a dour and gloomy woman, vexed and angered by the fall from dominance of her family, and that she blamed her troubles on her husband Aenar. What I find interesting about this is that it's never clearly stated if Elena, is Aenar's sister wife, or if they have any relation at all. Perhaps she was from another Dragon Lord family. But this does clue us in that polyamorous marriages were not uncommon in the Targaryen family prior to Aegon and his conquest of Westeros. As has been stated before, it seems that the fortunes for the Targaryen family were on the decline. Now, whether it's due to financial ruin or maybe even the inability to hatch dragons, it's not said. Nevertheless, it seems that the House Targaryen's salvation was due to its self-imposed exile. This was due to the prophetic visions of Daenerys the Dreamer, one of Aenar's children. Now, how much of this is really true in this respect that his daughter was actually seeing prophetic visions about the doom of Valyria itself? Well, we will know. George has written very little about it, and, well, this is a Song of Ice and Fire, so there is magic, however little of it there is. But if we pull in from the main series, Daenerys herself does get prophetic visions and dreams from Quaithe. So perhaps within this story, someone is sending Daenerys the Dreamer, Aenar's daughter, a vision about the future, but we don't know who it is, and I have no idea either. I wish I could add to that conversation. I don't know. Maybe a time traveling Bran did it. But from a practical perspective, perhaps Aenar sought to leave Valeria and set his family in Dragonstone to, I don't know, possibly invade Westeros. But once Aenar and his family arrive at Dragonstone, he makes no such moves to invade Westeros, and even after the doom of Valeria, he makes little effort to try to retake the fractured empire once again. But once Aenar and his family settle on Dragonstone, the doom of Valeria occurred 12 years later. As the text says, the Targaryens are the only dragon lords to survive. Except, not really. In the A Song of Ice and Fire world book, it states that there are some unnamed dragon lords that were located in the cities of Lys and Tyrosh that survived the doom, but that they were soon killed along with their dragons. The only dragon lord that gets named is Aurelian, I hope I'm saying that right, who declared himself Emperor of Valeria and led a host of 30,000 soldiers from the city of Qohor towards Valeria. But along the way, as he got to Valeria, he and his dragon and his army just disappeared.
At its apex, Valeria was the greatest city in the known world, the center of civilization. Within its shining walls, two score rival houses vied for power and glory in court and council, rising and falling in an endless, subtle, oft savage struggle for dominance. The Targaryens were far from the most powerful of the Dragon Lords, and their rivals saw their flight to Dragonstone as an act of surrender, as cowardice. But Lord Aenar's maiden daughter, Daenerys, known forever afterward as Daenerys the Dreamer, had foreseen the destruction of Valyria by fire. And when the doom came 12 years later, the Targaryens were the only Dragon Lords to survive.
So we get a little background on the city of Valeria and the Valerian freehold itself. Now, a good comparison for our real world purposes is the late Roman Republic before the civil wars fought by Julius Caesar. While not stated in Fire and Blood itself, in the World of Ice and Fire lore book, it states that Valeria grew from a city state on a peninsula to end up taking over what would be Slaver's Bay and the area that would become the free cities of Essos. And like Rome, Valeria itself is often attributed being the heart and apex of the civilized world. Then we are given the number of houses that vied for control of the Valyrian freehold itself, that being two score. A score, for those who don't know, is just 20. So two score, that gives us 40. So that gives us 40 noble families that sought control of Valyria. Except we are not given the exact number of families that fly dragons. A clue for this is that Targaryens are specifically named as dragon lords. But we know there are some Valyrian houses that do not ride dragons, like the Velaryons and the Celtigars. So, I imagine a number of Valyrian families that are able to ride dragons is not 40, it's actually lower than 40. Now, this is just me trying to come up with a number. So I imagine the number of Valyrian families that are able to ride dragons is even lower than that number of 40. Now, this will be my speculation coming up on how many of those 40 families are actually dragon lords and able to tame and ride dragons.
So, my guess for the number of noble Valyrian families that are actually Dragon Lords that actually control dragons and can fly them are 14. And hear me out. This is all this my quick little theory corner time. So in Valeria, there is a series of volcanic mountains called the 14 Flames. So based on that number, there should be 14 massive volcanoes on the Valyrian Peninsula. And I imagine the dragons of Valeria prefer to be near those volcanoes. So probably in the very, very, very ancient days of Valeria, ancestors from these noble dragon lighting houses probably lived at the foot of one of these volcanoes, and over time were able to bond with dragons and such. There would be one noble family from each one of the 14 flames, thus making 14. Valerian families that could ride dragons.
Either way, the number of noble Valerian families that could ride dragons would be low. If the Targaryens had 5 dragons and they were far from being the most powerful dragon lords, how many dragons would the most powerful dragon lord family have? 10? 15? Not to mention the sheer cost of housing a feeding dragon is enormous. While Valeria is wealthy, wealth is not infinite. Dragons need to eat. You need to pay people to take care of them, guard them. You need to build massive buildings to house them, like a dragon pit.
Dragonstone had been the westernmost outpost of Valerian power for 2 centuries. Its location athwart the gullet gave its lords a stranglehold on Blackwater Bay and enabled both Targaryens and their close allies, the Velaryons of Driftmark, a lesser house of Valerian descent, to fill their coffers off the passing trade. Valerian ships, along with those of another allied Valerian house, the Settlers of Claw Isle, dominate the middle reaches of the Narrow Sea, whilst the Targaryens ruled the skies with their dragons.
So, in this paragraph, we are given a brief description of Dragonstone and the houses that are allied with the Targaryens in Blackwater Bay. What is interesting is that Dragonstone had been a outpost for the Valyrian freehold for over 2 centuries. But how Valyria came to control the island is unknown, or even the fact we never get a description how the Valyrians and the Celtigars came to possess their islands. Did their ancestors come here to take the islands by force? If so, from whom? The Storelands under House Durrandon, maybe? If this is the case, why wasn't there a war to retake those islands back? Perhaps the Storelanders were deterred by the threat of dragons from the Valyrian freehold himself? But as we will see later in Aegon's conquest, dragons did not deter many of the kings from fighting Aegon, at least not initially. But perhaps the most likely reason is that these lands were purchased from the Durrandons. Okay, look, hear me out. So, real quick, a quick background on House Durrandon. House Durrandon was the house that controlled the Stormlands prior to the Baratheons and Aegon's conquest. And at the height of their territorial zenith, they controlled the Stormlands, the Crownlands, and the Riverlands, slowly losing territory to both rebelling river lords and the Ironborn themselves. And these wars cost gold. So, perhaps strapped for cash, the Durrandons sold these islands to the Velaryons, the Celtigars, and the Targaryens. Perhaps to them they held little economic value, as they are small, while they would be good for disrupting trade towards the Riverlands, trade going towards Duskendale, Stokeworth, Salt Pans, and Derry. Perhaps the Durrandons, while also selling these islands and making some amount of money to finance their wars, maybe they also thought it would lead to more open diplomatic relations with Valyria, which in turn eventually lead to an alliance. Perhaps the Durrandons thought even if they got one Dragon Lord family to side with them, just one dragon could make a big difference in a war against Ironborn.
Yet, even so, were the best part of 100 years after the doom of Valeria, the rightly named Century of Blood, House Targaryen looked east, not west, and took little interest in the affairs of Westeros. Gaemon Targaryen, brother and husband to Daenys the Dreamer, followed Aenar the Exile as Lord of Dragonstone and became known as Gaemon the Glorious. Gaemon's son Aegon and his daughter Elaena ruled together after his death. After them, the lordship passed to their son Magon, his brother Aerys, and Aerys' sons Aelix, Balon, and Daemon. The last of the 3 brothers was Damian, whose son Aerion then succeeded to Dragonstone. So in this paragraph, we get a little information on what the Targaryens were doing during the Century of Blood. And before Aegon's conquest, seems like they were doing very little for almost 100 years. We can infer a few things on what may have happened. Perhaps Gaemon, the Glorious, most likely being a dragon rider, participated in some of the battles that occurred between the new free cities of Valyria during their many wars during the Century of Blood. or after Gaemon, no ruler of Dragonstone seemed to get involved in much of anything. Perhaps it may be because the dragons that the Targaryens possessed were dying out. As we will learn later, Aegon the Conqueror would eventually claim Balerion, the Black Dread, and Balerion was the last of the original five dragons that came with Aenar the Exile. This means that Aegon's sister's dragons were born on Dragonstone. Perhaps realizing this, the successors after Gaemon the Glorious were hesitant to use their dragons in open battle as not to lose the one thing that made their family special and powerful.
Okay, so I've been talking a little too long, and I am terrible at editing and putting this stuff together. So we'll stop here for now, and I'll see you in part two. Thanks for watching. I'm Blue, and I'll see you next time.